Okay, welcome everyone to Virtual Playhouse. My name is Dan. I'm the Director of Development and Programming for the Bedford Playhouse. And as we're operating now in a virtual setup, we thank you for taking the time to join us this evening, what we think is going to be a really great and fun program. Before we get started, for those of you who are not familiar with Zoom or might be using it not in this webinar format, we invite you at any point to ask questions. There is a Q&A button, which you can find at the bottom of your screen if you are on a laptop or PC. I believe if you are on an iPad or a phone, it's towards the top. And you can post any question. Rob will do his best to answer when we get to the Q&A portion of the evening. I also just want to mention that we are closed right now still, thanks to the effects of the COVID-19 virus. So if you enjoy this evening's program and you'd like to see more of it, we hope that you might take some time before you turn off your devices to visit our website, which is bedfordplayhouse.org, and consider making a donation on our Ways to Give tab. Any amount is appreciated, or you might consider becoming a member. Members get benefits such as discounts on tickets and other things. Right now, we do curbside concessions on Fridays for your weekend streaming. You can get discounts on that. We do online trivia. And as we get ready, hopefully start gearing up to reopen shortly, you'll be able to use your membership for discounts within the theater itself. Normally, in a perfect scenario, we would have screened this movie tonight at Playhouse, and then Rob would have talked about it afterwards, but such is the world we're living in right now. So unfortunately, we don't have that, but we hopefully will for the next installment, fingers crossed. So with that being said, I want to introduce Rob, invite Rob to come on and join us here. There he comes. Hey, Rob.
Hey, Dan.
So Rob, it's all your show. I just want to say to everybody who's listening, I'm sure Rob is sick of me telling him how much I love this movie, so I won't bore him or you with any more of those details. So Rob, take it away, all yours.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Dan, and thanks everybody that's on. This is a little strange being the only person I can see on the screen right now, but I can see the list of people that are joining, so that's fun to be able to see who's listening to me ramble on. I had this idea for this soundtracks series that I proposed to the Playhouse, and Dan and his team were super excited about it, especially when I proposed one of the suggestions being the commitments. The commitments, for those of you who didn't do your homework or haven't watched the movie or haven't watched it recently, is a movie that came out in 1991, directed by Alan Parker, who you may know from having directed a couple of small movies like Birdie and Fame and Mississippi Burning. And, he's a very well-known director. But the point of this entire series, and hopefully this is going to continue to be a series, is that soundtracks are more than just the songs you hear at a movie. The way I look at them is that I look at songs from I look at soundtracks like I do olfactory triggers, like when you go to a baseball game for the first time, and you'll never forget smelling popcorn or hot dogs or beer or whatever. And every time you smell those things afterwards, you're brought back to that game. You're brought back to that memory because it jumps right into your brain. I look at soundtracks and the songs from movies the same way. Take a song like "Stuck in the Middle with You" by Steelers Wheel. A lot of people knew that song because it came out in the late 70s, and it was Jerry Rafferty, and it was a great song. But until it was in Reservoir Dogs in 1992, it didn't really become part of the pop culture, world. And every time anyone I know hears that song, all they can think of is Michael Madsen doing that creepy dance as Mr. Blonde when he's about to, give the cop a shave, as it were. But the point is, listening to soundtracks is like a portable way of reliving a movie. And the way I look at them is there are lots and lots of types of soundtracks. and there are lots of variations on the, you have the big sweeping, like The Mission with Ennio Morricone, with just, it's all dramatic symphonic music. Or you have things like Fame, directed by Alan Parker, that is all sung by a number of the people that are in the movie, but also people that perform within the movie. The Commitments is one of those examples of a soundtrack where you not only have great songs that represent a specific kind of time frame, not necessarily the time frame for the movie, but that represent a time or a feeling, or in this case, a genre, soul music being the genre. And to go back, for those who haven't seen the movie recently, the movie surrounds a group of musicians that get together to become a band in Northern Ireland, in Northern Dublin. And it's put together by Jimmy Rabbit. He is an aspiring manager. And one of the gags that they have through the movie is he's being interviewed by Terry Wogan, who is an Irish TV presenter and is the host of the Eurovision contest for 20 or 30 years. But Jimmy puts together this band, and as he's going to see all of these different musicians that he wants to have in the band, you hear him explain why it's going to be soul to the bass player and the guitar player who he goes to see at a wedding at the very beginning of the movie. And there's lots of little gags throughout the movie, like, Jimmy being interviewed by Terry Wogan. He's sitting in the bathtub being interviewed. It just kind of carries it along, like his anticipation of fame from what he's going to get out of this band. But he puts this band together with a few musicians that he knows, a few that he stumbles across. But then there's this hilarious sequence where he has put an ad in the local paper and he's inviting people to come try out to be members of this band. He has the core band already, and he asks some people to come and ask some girls to come and sing. But then he has tryouts, and the tryouts are hilarious because it's him opening his front door and asking what their influences are. And I'm sure they, ad-libbed a lot of them, but one kid comes to the door looking like George Michael, and he gets the door shut before he can even say anything. Somebody says that they're into Joni Mitchell, and he shuts the door on her. But the point is that he put it out there to try and get people from North Dublin to be in this band. And one of the very cool things about the way that the soundtrack and the casting of the movie was put together is that that's exactly what Alan Parker did. He brought together hundreds and hundreds of Dublin musicians to try out for this movie, to try out to be parts in the movie. And Robert Arkins, who plays Jimmy, is actually the singer or the trumpet player in a band. And if you buy the movie on iTunes like I did, it comes with a bunch of little mini documentaries, and one of them is footage of some of the tryouts for the movie. And you can see Robert Arkins playing, and he plays trumpet with this kind of punk trumpet band. It's kind of a funny thing, hard to describe unless you've seen it. But he doesn't really get the part as the bass player, which he tried out for. He becomes the manager because he looks the part. And Alan Parker talks a lot about why he looks the part. But Jimmy's idea is that because North Dublin is the hardest hit part of Ireland, then soul is the music that speaks to them. And there's one quote that he makes that I had to write down where he says, soul is the rhythm of sex and the factory. And, the way he's explaining it to these kids that are in this band, they don't really know whether to buy it or not, but he's so determined and he's so convinced that this is what's going to happen that they kind of sign on. And there's a lot of preamble to the band becoming a band, as they have people come and try out, and they find these three girls that become the Commitmentettes to be singers. There's a whole there's a whole like buildup of the social part of it. And what I think is fun is that throughout the movie, you see Jimmy going to see each of these people in their places of work. And unfortunately, the three girls don't have jobs. So you see them rehearsing out amongst laundry in the yard of a tenement complex. And he goes and finds the singer, Andrew Strong, who's like a bus conductor. But all of these people he's gone and sought out. And I think it's important that he's gone to find them all at their places of employment. Even though he's on the dole and the saxophone player's on the dole, they put this band together. And it appeals to me as a musician because you get to see the band created from nothing. You get to see it become, a thing. You see them go to their first rehearsal and it's kind of a mess. And then it goes, they get through the first rehearsal and they play Mustang Sally a bunch of times. And he has to explain to the girls that are singing it that it's Ride, Sally, Ride, not Royd, Sally, Royd, because they all have, thick accents. And soul music is predominantly American. And he doesn't care. He wants it to be legit because he wants the soul music to be the basis for this band. And they end up with an old guy named whose real name is Johnny Murphy, but he plays a guy named Jimmy Lips Fagan, who either has or hasn't played with a whole bunch of people, but at some point they listen to records at his house with his mom, and they find that he's actually on the backs of the records, and they're records that they know, which is kind of fun because it's a subtle hint at the fact that Jimmy's legit, even though you're not really sure. But at any rate, the movie gets pulled together, and Joey Lips. The band gets pulled together, and they find a place to rehearse. And Jimmy has to, sell his soul to get gear from a local loan shark. And they put the band together, and hook or by crook, they get it going. And they play their first gig at a church hall, and the only reason they get it is because it's a benefit for fighting heroin addiction. And he gets his younger brother to make a banner because he's good with art, and he makes a banner, and instead of spelling heroin, he spells heroin with an E. And he says, yeah, there's only one E in heroin, so they have to fix it right before the show starts. But the movie is a constant delivery of these amazing songs, from Mustang Sally to Take Me to the River, songs that were, huge hits all over the world, but particularly by American artists. And these guys are like the downtrodden North Dublin kids who are just nailing this stuff. And it's a great band. It's guitar, bass, drums, trumpet, saxophone, a medical student on piano, and then the three girls. But one of the interesting things that I found early on, I used to work at a record store when this movie came out, and we sold a lot of the soundtrack. And I remember watching the movie in the theaters and getting the soundtrack and listening to it. And one of the funny things that came out of the auditions that they did of all the bands and all the musicians from North Dublin was the singer. And they had, there was a guy who was like a location manager. His name was Peter Strong or something. And he had his son with him who was helping out with some of the singing parts with the rehearsals. And they heard him sing, and they said, hey, do you want to try out? And he said, sure, why not? And so he sang, and they couldn't believe what this kid sounded like. Not only did he have this giant voice that could convey like soul music to a T, but he was kind of a mess. And so he made a perfect character for this movie, to be the lead singer, Deco, who frankly nobody in the movie really liked. But the thing that's most amazing about Andrew Strong, the kid who played this Deco character, is that he was 16 when they made this movie. And if you've heard the soundtrack and if you've seen the movie, you would not believe that this kid was 16. He sounds like he's 35 and has been smoking cigarettes his whole life. I mean, 16, he may have been smoking his entire life, but he sounds like he's 35 and he's from Detroit or someplace. But it's just an amazing voice, and it's kind of mind-blowing to think that he's actually only 16. Another really interesting thing about the soundtrack, and by the way, if you have questions or you want to jump in and add anything, by all means, please do. I can get the questions pop up for me, and I'm happy to take the discussion in any direction you want. But one of the very interesting things about this movie is, in picking all of the songs, Alan Parker worked with a bunch of different people to choose the songs, and they narrowed it down based on who they ended up with in the band. And obviously with Andrew Strong as a singer, he could he could sing anything. But what they did for the movie, which is kind of interesting, is that all of the live performances that you see with Andrew singing are actually the point where the songs for the soundtrack were recorded. So they went into a studio and recorded all the backing tracks and most of the backing vocals for all of the songs. But during the actual filming, they had live microphones recording direct to multi-track recorders. And in some of these little documentaries, you can see them doing it. And they're playing back the songs. They're playing back the tracks for the band to hear on stage. But the actual recordings, what's being put down on tape, is that performance that you're seeing. And that always struck me as something very unique about a movie, especially a movie about live performance, because most movies that you see live performance, it's lip synced, and they either do a great job or they don't. I've seen plenty of movies where the lip syncing is just horrendous, or the band's not really playing the same thing. This was as true to the songs as it could possibly be. And by having Andrew do the vocals live, it just added something to it. And knowing that, if you watch the movie again, gives it a lot more meaning, because you can see the emotion that he's putting into it, the just the effort that he's putting into singing these songs, which are not easy to sing, but he's literally putting them down on track, and that's what you hear on the soundtrack. And I think that that's kind of an amazing attribute for a movie which has some very complicated and very well-known songs that you just don't mess around with them. But the songs get better and better as they go through the movie, and the band gets better and better, and they evolve as a band to the point that the drummer gets so sick of Deco that he quits, and he takes his drum kit and he takes his moving van with him. So they have to replace him with their bouncer, this guy named Mika, who's frankly a loaded cannon. He's great because he plays their bouncer and their drummer. And in one of the gigs, somebody gives him a hard time at the gig, and he jumps off the stage, takes care of the guy that's giving Jimmy a hard time, and gets back on stage covered in blood, but finishes the song. And I think that's dedication. But it's a soundtrack with songs that everybody would know from their childhood. And I think when Alan Parker was making this movie and they were doing test showings, it wasn't resonating with younger audiences like he expected, because he assumed that the younger musicians would appeal to a younger audience. But because they were playing songs that were known more by a generation or even another generation older than the actors in the movie, he decided that they were going to change the marketing a bit, and they ended up focusing it on a slightly older demographic, which makes a lot of sense when you think back to how old the songs were. Happy to list the songs. they actually did 2 soundtracks for this, and I always think that's an interesting sign of the success of a soundtrack if they have a follow-up soundtrack. Dazed and Confused, one of my favorite soundtracks that may be a future discussion, had a second soundtrack. But the first soundtracks went triple platinum in the U.S., which means it sold 3 million copies. I'm not sure how many it did, but Simon, the songs are from the original soundtrack are Mustang Sally, which there are a lot of versions out there. Take Me to the River, obviously Al Green, but very well-known version by the Talking Heads as well. Chain of Fools, Aretha Franklin. Dark End of the Street by James Carr. Destination Anywhere by the Marvelettes, which was actually written by Ashford and Simpson of Solid as a Rock fame. I Can't Stand the Rain by Ann Peebles. Try a Little Tenderness, which was really well covered by a lot of people. Treat Her Right, which is a song that was used in the some of the trailers, and to great effect, because it's a relatively quiet song. It's kind of a vamp for most of the song, and then they jump to the hey part, but they do really well in the movie. And the Do Right Woman, Do Right Man, Aretha Franklin, and then one of Otis Redding's most famous songs, Mr. Pitiful. I Never Loved a Man by Aretha Franklin. In the Midnight Hour, obviously by Wilson Pickett. And they do that at the end, one of the last performances, when they are hoping that Wilson Pickett's actually going to stop by. And the sad thing about the end of the movie, and I'm not going to give it away too much by saying the fact that Jimmy the Lips tried to get Wilson Pickett to come to the show because he was playing in Dublin that night. And he, for whatever reason, was late, but everybody didn't believe Jimmy, who believed Joey, and then Wilson never showed, and the band had a huge fight and effectively broke up, mostly over the fact that they couldn't get along, but also because Wilson Pickett didn't show up. But then he did, and he runs into Jimmy on the street, and then it's kind of a MacGuffin in the movie at that point. Last 2 songs, Bye Bye Baby by Mary Wells and Slip Away by Clarence Carter. Those are the songs on the first soundtrack. There were a couple others, like Hard to Handle, which is an Otis Redding song, as well as the version that's super well known by the Black Crowes. That was they did that a couple of times in the movie, and I wish they'd really expanded more on that, because it's a great song, and they do a fantastic version of it. Simon asked, one of the questions was, can you also talk about the female lead singer? There's a couple of people that sang on the record. The woman that actually did most of the lead singing and did the Aretha songs, and I Can't Stand the Rain. I don't know whether she did I Can't Stand the Rain on the soundtrack, but the Aretha songs were sung by Niamh Cavenagh, different spelling entirely from me, a famous Irish singer who ended up winning the Eurovision contest a few years later. She was well known at this point, but it really launched her career. But she sang those 2 songs, the 2 Aretha songs, even though they made it look like it was Maria Doyle who played Natalie, who did a tremendous job making it look like she was. The songs that are sung that are male leads were all, for the most part, done by Andrew Strong, the 16-year-old kid who sounded like a 35-year-old guy. But the backup vocals were sung by the 3 girls in the movie. Angeline Ball, who played Imelda, Maria Doyle is Natalie Murphy, and then Brana Gallagher, who plays Bernie McLaughlin. And Brana, to take off on the question from Bobby O, Brana actually was in Pulp Fiction a couple of years later. She's Trudy, I think her name was. She was one of the 2 women that was in Eric Stoltz's house when John Travolta brings Uma Thurman there because she's having an overdose, and so that was one of her big movie things. But she ended up having a big career in TV after that. But a number of them did actually have music careers after that. And yes, they did tour as the cast of the Commitments. It wasn't the entire band. At first, it was really the two guys that played guitar on the record, not the guys that were necessarily in the cast. I think one of them, I think Derek, who was the bass player, was. Dick Massey was Billy, and then Philip Gormley. Yeah, he was Dean. Yeah, they did do a tour afterwards, and apparently they had a lot of fun because they took the band along with them when they did a press tour for the movie afterwards, and had a little bit too much of a good time, and they had to kind of rein them in. But what's notable about a couple of the people from an acting side first, Colm Meaney, who plays the dad, Jimmy Rabbit Sr., is obviously a super well-known actor and has been in just, dozens of movies, including the two movies that were the follow-ups to this. There was actually a movie called Snapper and then The Van, and they were all based on Roddy Doyle novels, and they made a trilogy of them. I've never seen Snapper or The Van, but The Van is apparently the continuation of the story of the van that the band buys, or steals rather, to become their tour bus. And they turn into a chip truck, which is what it was in the Commitments. I guess they revive it as a chip truck, and it's supposed to be funny. I've not seen it, but so a couple of the people that came out of the band that became musicians later, Glenn Hansard is probably one of the most famous ones. He played Outspan Foster. He was the guitar player with the curly red hair, and he's well known for a number of reasons. He formed a band called The Frames that was an indie band in the early 90s, and then he has done a bunch of stuff on his own, just as Glenn Hansard, and has worked with a bunch of other people on different projects. But the thing I think he's best known for is that he wrote the musical and did the music for Once. And that, I don't know if anybody's seen that movie or seen the movie that they made about it, but this is a fantastic movie. It's set in a music store that's also a vacuum shop. They did a great show. I saw it off Broadway, and it's really great. Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yeah, he won the Oscar for Best Song for Once. It was just a tremendous soundtrack. But little known from that group, Andrew Strong went on to have a career more on the strength of him being Andrew Strong from the Commitments than anything else. And I don't really think that he really found his niche. I think he tried to repeat the success he had with being in the movie, and it never really got anywhere from my perspective. But what's interesting is that Jimmy Rabbit's younger sister, Sharon, who refuses to loan the other brother her hairdryer, is actually Andrea Corr. And they were, she was one of the three sisters who, along with their brother, became a band called The Corrs, Corrs. And they were super well known in Ireland. And they had a couple of albums. I actually worked with them when I worked at Atlantic Records years and years and years ago. But they had a few songs. I wouldn't say they really blew up or anything like that, but they had a career, and they still play. And I know that Jim Corr, who was in the movie, all four of the Corrs were in the movie. Andrea played the younger sister. Jim and the other two sisters were some of the people that tried out to be in the band and weren't successful. But the music advisor for the movie, the music supervisor, whose name is John Hughes, not the same John Hughes that was the director, but ultimately became the manager of the Corrs later and took them to international success. But that, to answer Bobby O's question, it did launch a musical career for a number of them. Bronna Gallagher has had a not an insignificant singing career. That you can find a bunch of these people on Spotify, and if I can get my head around doing it, I can pull together a bunch of the folks that were in the Commitments as a Spotify playlist, because they definitely have work there. Maria Doyle also has a fantastic voice in her own right, and she is I think she continues to sing. Tom could probably answer this better since he met her, but it's to come out of a movie from 30 years ago and continue to be able to sing and make a living out of doing it is an amazing thing. But it was a time and a place, certainly, for that movie and for that band that they put together. Whether you think of the band as the actual band, which it wasn't necessarily, or just the band that was in the movie and what they represented. To quote Joey Lips at the end, he said, "Success of the band was irrelevant. You raised their horizons." He says that to Jimmy at the end, and I think that that's really telling, because this movie is about the rise and fall of a band that was already had nothing, and to give them a little glimpse of what they could achieve and what they could get to, and to Jimmy's point, to Joey's point, raise their horizons it's great. And it ends on kind of a sad note, because you see them all in these other bands. Bernie joins a country and western band, and you see them trying to find other ways to take the band and take themselves someplace absent the band. But the producers of the film and the actors did a look back 10 years later, and then they did a 25 years later, about 4 or 5 years ago. And a couple of the people have shuffled off this mortal coil, sadly. But it was really interesting to see them, and to see in their real lives that they've taken what they got from that movie and moved it forward, because they all wanted to be musicians, and they really want to they really want to live the life that they played in that movie. At least that's my perspective on it. But as a soundtrack, it stands tall for lots of reasons, not just because it's a great bunch of songs, but because it's a great bunch of songs by a band that you're seeing trying to put them together. And that carries something that, what we used to call like the Wednesday marketing meeting soundtracks. It does so much more than that. Wednesday marketing meeting soundtracks were what my friends and I used to call the soundtracks that labels would put together for movies that won a deal with Miramax or whatever. Likely not Miramax, because they had really good soundtracks, but some random movie studio needed a soundtrack, and so the label would throw together all the different artists that they had and say, oh, we could put this person on, we could put this person on. And then you hear the soundtrack, you're like, that doesn't really do anything for the movie. It doesn't really carry the plot. It really doesn't do anything for anything. It's just on there to be on there. And sometimes you end up with soundtracks that are music from and inspired by. And those always worry me, because you end up having songs that weren't in the movie and have nothing to do with it, and are just in a contractual obligation for the label or somebody else. But at any rate, I'm getting off topic. And are there any other questions about what the soundtrack that anybody wanted to ask? Or
Rob, this is Dan. We actually had a couple of questions that were submitted in advance via email. So can I ask you those?
Sure.
So one question that we got basically was, can you talked about Robert Arkins in the beginning, about how he was probably the most accomplished musician of the group, and he's the one person who doesn't play a note or sing in the movie, if I'm not mistaken. But he does appear on the soundtrack. Which songs does he sing on the soundtrack? I think there's a couple. The person is asking, doesn't he also appear on the soundtrack?
I think he sings. He might be the person that sings "Treat Her Right" or sings with it, because that's to me most in line. I'll look and I can confirm which one it is. But yeah, it was funny that he was the most accomplished musician that had tried out. He tried out to be the bass player, I think, and the keyboard player, and they ultimately created this role as Jimmy Rabbit for him, who was in the book as far as I recall. But yeah, he ultimately ended up becoming a music producer and doing more recording and engineering than I think performing. And he was doing some rap because in one of the documentaries that I saw, he was playing back some of the rap that he was doing. He's like, yeah, it's not really me, but it pays the bills. But yeah, I'm not sure that's really the answer that they were looking for. I don't know off the top of my head.
This was more of a comment than a question.
Sure.
And given that these, here's another one that I think is kind of interesting. Given that these songs are also relatively well known and iconic, can you talk a little bit about the juxtaposition of having them performed? You did a little bit before, I guess you kind of covered this, about them being performed by this group of young Dubliners singing these soul classics. And do you think that that was sort of the, I guess gimmick is not really the right word, but was that the gimmick that kind of made the movie appealing to certain people, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous quote that Jimmy makes where he says, the Irish are the blacks of Europe, and Dubliners are the blacks of Ireland, and North Dubliners are the blacks of Dublin. And that's what he uses in his reasoning for why they should play soul music. And having a group of white kids who are as downtrodden economically, in any way you want to look at it, in North Dublin, singing songs that are trying to help them rise above, these jubilant rock songs. I mean, soul music is basically rock with horns and more backing singers. But the fact that you have these white kids doing, which is predominantly black music, or what people think of as black music, I think is part of the reason why you have that juxtaposition that makes it not funny, but makes it like valid, that they have a reason for wanting to sing these songs about pain and heartbreak and sorrow, because they know pain and heartbreak and sorrow.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's interesting that there were a couple of people in the band who were actors, not musicians, correct? Right. And did they fake it, or did they get some rudimentary crash course lessons in how to play?
I don't think anything you hear is actually them playing. Glenn Hansard is actually playing. The drummer is actually playing. The piano player, the guy who was the medical student, was actually a keyboard player. And he actually didn't want to have anything to do with any of their reunions or anything like that. But Johnny Murphy, who was a well-known actor before the Commitments, who played Joey Lips, didn't play the trumpet. And apparently Alan Parker really wanted to have Van Morrison play his role, and Van Morrison wanted nothing to do with it. But he would have been obviously a catch. But, you see Jimmy playing, or Johnny playing Joey. There's Jimmy, there's Johnny, there's Joey. Sorry, it's hard to keep track of them all. Joey plays the trumpet a lot, and you hear him playing a couple of things at the beginning to warm up, and they're like, we're not going to play that song. And he's like, no, but that's the song I used to warm up. And then he gets into it and he plays, but that's obviously just faking with the actual player. But, you can hide behind a really good backing track if you know what you're doing. And with a trumpet, as long as nobody knows what you're doing with the trumpet and the valves, as long as you're blowing and moving it at the same time as the saxophone player, I don't think anybody's really going to notice.
There's a couple of quick questions that are still we have still on the thread.
Okay.
What other movies do you think come to mind that are similar about strangers coming together to form a band? Is there anything that comes out that stands out to your mind? Similar format?
less strangers, but one of the movies that you and I talked about that I'd really love to do as a conversation is That Thing You Do, which
Sure.
is a movie that's set in the 60s in Erie, Pennsylvania, about a band that has an opportunity to play at a battle of the bands. And the day of the battle of the bands, their drummer falls and breaks his arm. And so they turn to a guy they know whose name is Guy, and they ask him if he'll play. And he comes by their house and they do a rehearsal of the song, and it's like kind of a slow ballad, and they play it. And that movie is all, and we can save some of that discussion if we can do that movie later. But that, is all about putting that band together and their rise. So that's definitely one about putting a band together. There's lots of movies about bands that also have fantastic soundtracks. Another one that I really like is Almost Famous. It's not creating a band, but it's about a band and what they do and how they deal with trials and tribulations of suddenly becoming famous. But the greatest being in a band movie of all time is, to me, is A Hard Day's Night.
Sure.
I mean, you don't get more being in a band than being part of the biggest band in the universe.
Yeah.
The height of their.
It helps to be in the best band ever, right?
Yeah, it helps. That helps.
Well, Rob, this was great. And, I do want to say that we would love to do this again. There's certainly no shortage of great soundtracks. And hopefully, as I said at the top, sooner rather than later, we can start screening some of these films at the theater and then having these conversations after everybody's had a chance to enjoy them. So thank you very, very much. Are there any other questions, kind of last minute? Anybody want to pipe in? Anyone? Let's see.
I'm looking through the list.
I think you covered all of them, Rob.
Yeah, I tried to.
All right.
But yeah,
well, so
if anybody has any follow-up questions, if they want to send them through you, I'm happy to respond.
Sure, you can send them to programming@bedfordplayhouse.org, and we'll make sure Rob gets the questions and can respond to them.
Yeah, and thanks so much for letting me do this. People that know me know that I have no problem talking about music, and to be able to combine music and movies is, just a dream come true for me, because soundtracks are one of the things that I'm particularly fond of.
Start making your list.
I will.
All right. Well, thanks again for tuning in, everybody. Have a great night, and hope we'll see you next time, either knock wood at the theater or online here.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
Take it easy. Have a good night.